whose conspiracy newsletter appears in the Realist magazine, has for over 2.5 years shared with KLRB listeners the fruits of her decades' research into political assassinations and other abuses of power in America. The weekly commentary on KLRB-FM is the most hard-hitting and comprehensive report of its kind in the country, relating as it does the news of the week to the evidence emerging about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains its power by force over America's electoral and executive processes. Dialog Conspiracy, a unique talk show. It's the most up-to-date, well-documented, no-nonsense political analysis going. And it goes over KLRB FM 102 on Monday afternoons at 5:15.
Good afternoon for Dialog Conspiracy. This is November the 12th. This is number 126 in our programs. That's 2.5 years of broadcasting this show. The news of the week covers so many broad areas. I'm going to jump around today and cover a lot of different subjects instead of centering into one particular subject. Before we get started, I want to make an announcement again for those who get this tape on the East Coast or any that are lucky enough on the West Coast to go back east. There will be a 2-day conference at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. on November 23rd and 24th in the large auditorium there, and program day and evening. Discussing, the Committee to Investigate Assassinations is putting on this 2-day program to discuss the political assassinations of President John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and the shooting of George Wallace. The group got together because it was the 10th anniversary of the assassination of President John Kennedy, but these other murders are very much a part of the total conspiratorial process. And Bob Cutler, I believe, is going to be down there and may present some work on the Chappaquiddick affair, the accident at Chappaquiddick that kept Ted Kennedy from running for president in 1972. There's going to be the movie The Second Gun, the new movie on the shooting of Robert Kennedy, and Executive Action, the movie that was just completed on the shooting of President John Kennedy. You can call your local theaters or write letters and ask them to show these movies. I hope you people are doing it. The Executive Gun, Executive Action, and The Second Gun. Ask your local theaters to please carry these movies. For local people, the Realist article that I wrote this year and the one the year before at the Carmel Thunderbird Bookstore and Aries Arts up in Santa Cruz, Capitola. People keep writing to me and wanting the address of my newsletter and the Realist. These are the 2 local addresses, and then the rest I'll fill out and answer your letters and send the information to you by mail. There's a new book out which is important to read. It's written by Bob Cutler. He was a guest on my show about a year ago. He was out here in Carmel, California. He's an architect, lives in Manchester, Massachusetts, who has spent 3 years, since 1972, not 3 years, since 69, 71, 72, doing the investigation of Chappaquiddick, of Ted Kennedy's accident. And he has a new book called You, the Jury. You know, there was no trial on the murder of Mary Jo Kopechne. And the book is called You, the Jury. It's published by Cutler Designs, 38 Union Street, Manchester, Massachusetts. It's $10, and it's an excellent book. It just came out. He's publishing it himself, and it's a very good book to own to set the record straight on the accident at Chappaquiddick that killed Mary Jo Kopechne and assured Richard Nixon that Ted Kennedy would not be giving him any competition for the election in 1972. I was reading the reconstruction of the election of Hitler in 1933 and how he had eliminated all opposition and candidates so that his victory in 1933 was assured. And I didn't realize how carefully the manipulation of Hitler into power closely paralleled our electoral process in this country. What took place in Germany took place here, so that all the people that could defeat Richard Nixon were out of the running. They were eliminated. There's a little introduction to this book on Chappaquiddick called You, the Jury. And it goes into the killing of President John Kennedy and why they would do that, and the killing of Robert Kennedy. And then it says, during the ensuing summer, a wondrous pile of money poured into the campaign for Nixon, and he was duly installed as the cabal's new figurehead in January of '69. You remember at the Watergate hearings, the subject came up that Mr. Tony Lasowitz, who was up at Chappaquiddick right after Mary Kopechne drowned, we don't know when she got there. He testified he was there later, but he was never asked if he got there before. He received from Herbert Kalmbach $100,000 in 1969. This was just at the time of the accident. He happened to be up there, and he had all this money, $100,000. So what Bob Cutler was saying, a large amount of money was poured into the Nixon campaign in '69, and CREEP, the committee to re-elect the president, was 2 months old, and the re-election was the battle cry for almost everybody. Within less than half a year, the battle was joined when it became too apparent that the cabal would have to deal with the last of the Kennedys in 1972. During the first half of '69, Edward Kennedy was talking about the idiocy of the Indochina fiasco and looked to be way ahead of all Democratic opponents as presidential nomination, still 3 years away. When he became the enemy, the cabal decided on a political rather than an actual assassination. The public might just catch on with 3 murders in the same family. I doubt if they would, but Cutler thinks they might catch on. I think he gives people too much credit. The Dallas scenario was revised slightly. The patsy, this is Mary Jo Kopechne, was eliminated as part of the initial action, thereby drawing attention away from the facts, which clearly indicated a cleverly devised accident involving a presidential aspirant in a scandal from which he would be unable to extricate himself morally. The facts, which point up to foul play by persons unknown, Cutler says unknown, but I know which ones were involved through my research. He has it stated as unknown, belie the accepted story of a simple motor vehicle accident involving a fatality. The car was seen on dry land 1 hour and 25 minutes after the driver alleged that he went off the bridge. The blood stain on the girl's blouse were not seen by the scuba driver, the police, the medical examiner, or the mortician, or the 4 men who handled the body en route to shipment for its final burial. No cuts or bruises or abrasions were found on the body to discover the residual traces of blood during benzidine testing of the blouse. The car was overly damaged for the simple flip and roof landing, and the 40-foot distance from takeoff was well in excess from what could be expected from a 20-mile-an-hour speed, testified by the Motor Vehicle Registry inspector. When coupled with straight skid marks across the wooden bridge, simple logic finds them incompatible with normal driver reaction to danger. Only 2 positive identifications of Kennedy were made after the alleged accident were done by voice alone, with the speaker a distance away in the shadows, and most compelling evidence points to foul play. Is Kennedy, during his last half hour of conversation with his friend Saturday morning on the porch outside his hotel room. There was talk about the races the next day, no mention of an automobile accident. Chappaquiddick was never mentioned. 2 cottage cookout companions arrived on that porch where he was having breakfast. At 8 in the morning, they went to his room for a conference. Kennedy said to the police, "When I fully realized what happened this morning, I immediately contacted the police. Nobody ever bothered to understand this, let alone believe it." See, he was told what happened, and he went back to the bridge after he was told what happened to Mary Jo Kopechne. What happened was that a presidential hopeful had been framed politically in a scandal involving drinking at a cookout and a young woman drowned in an automobile accident on the way to the beach. Kennedy had been ambushed on his way to the ferry and returned to his hotel room by persons unknown. Voice identification was effected by a double impersonating Kennedy using a device similar to the one loaned Hunt by the CIA for his Denver interview with Dita Beard. The accident was engineered by rigging the car to drive itself off the bridge with the victim out. Recovery of the body and the candidate's legal maneuvers to extricate himself from the trap provided the cover-up vital to the perfected Dallas scenario. When in May of 1970, Kennedy announced his retirement from the '72 campaign for presidency, the cabal was among the few who understood and believed him. That's just a little summary of the book, because in the first realist article I did in July of '72, a lot of people, I mentioned the fact that Kennedy didn't drive a car and the car went off the bridge. And this book is based on a lot of research and goes into the evidence which I believe happened, that Kennedy was taken from the cottage, abducted and drugged, and taken back somewhere, and the car, Mary Jo Kaveci, was put in the back of the car, and the car was turned over, and she drowned, and he didn't know until the morning, till he came back at the island, that his car was turned over or that somebody was in it. I got a letter from Marguerite Oswald, that's the mother of the alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. She sent it to the various researchers in commemoration for her son's death, his cold-blooded murder in Dallas. And this is the letter that she wrote. It says 1963, Fort Worth, Texas, November 29th, 1963. The President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, created a commission to evaluate all the facts and circumstances surrounding the assassination of President Kennedy and the subsequent killing of the alleged assassin, and to report its findings and conclusions to him. By his order of November 29th, a commission was formed, and President Johnson selected Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the United States, as his chairman. Because I was critical of the commission, I was asked, Mrs. Oswald, are you implying that the Chief Justice would whitewash evidence or hide information so the American people, as well as the whole world, would never learn the truth? I answered yes, that in the same name of security, men of integrity, who are the most esteemed and most respected and honored, who have the welfare of their country at heart, would be most likely to do exactly what the White House wanted and thought necessary. The Watergate affair has followed this pattern. Those we believe are above reproach, those who have reached the pinnacle or are near it, those who are guiding our nation's destiny, are found to have manipulated events to accomplish certain things that they think were good for the country. Those who have a deep sense of patriotism and loyalty are most likely to twist events to accomplish their purpose. 10 years ago, I went on record before the Warren Commission on various television programs to this effect. The Watergate affair only strengthens my conviction and proves my theory. The suspect was my son and 7 such respected men, branded a dead man who was neither tried nor convicted as an assassin. Signed, Marguerite Oswald. Now, Marguerite Oswald said that people in the Justice Department, in the name of security, men of integrity, can be used for a certain purpose. And I think of the nomination now of Mr. Saxby as Attorney General, and he says he won't investigate the Kent State, which was a flagrant conspiracy. There were orders to shoot the students. They aimed at the students. 4 were fatally wounded, and the whole investigation was covered up in spite of massive evidence of the firing that went off as a signal to go ahead and shoot at the students, and the photographic evidence, the tape recordings to back these allegations up. So you see, the new Attorney General is capable, on orders of the White House, of covering up the truth if he gets an order from the White House. And people thought 10 years ago when Marguerite Oswald said these things that the woman was crazy. But all you have to do is take the words that she said before the Warren Commission and compare them to what's happening in Washington right now, and you can see that she was, in fact, telling the truth. If her son didn't do the murder of John Kennedy, and if they were lying about him and his background and his espionage connections, which they tried to keep secret, the actual truth of his contacts and where he had been would have come out, and she would have made a fool of herself. She has tried desperately for 10 years to get the truth out, and she would have nothing to gain by begging for a new investigation when it would still end up where they said it did in the first place. If she feels they have new evidence and fights for it for 10 years, she wants to present that to the American public, and the Washington officials won't let her. And just like we talked about that new book that's out on Kent State and all the work that went into making that book by private citizens, and Mr. Richardson was going to open up the Justice Department and investigate Kent State because of the massive evidence. So it was a very neat ploy to remove Mr. Richardson from office, and now the new Attorney General says we won't open Kent State. He knows the people there. He was in the National Guard. He's involved directly. So he steps right in and protects his friends. And we see this with Mr. Jaworski being named as a new special prosecutor, where his friends are involved in a number of deals, and the Mexican money transaction, the wheat deal, the El Paso gas, the milk deal, problems before the Justice Department. He's a very important appointment because he's going to put the lid on investigating his buddies, his cohorts. The movie, the executive action, is playing in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and there was a special screening in Washington, D.C. You may have read about it in the paper. This last week, the senators were all invited to see the executive action. Some of them had mixed feelings about it. Senator Ernest Hollings said something interesting. He said, everybody knows where they were on that day, and this film is incredible. When they asked him if the investigation should be reopened, Hollings said, we can't even investigate what's going on under our own noses. So he passed that off. But he did say the movie was incredible, and everyone knows where they were on that day. Well, almost everyone knows where they were that day, but Richard Nixon didn't remember where he was that day. And last week I mentioned it briefly on the radio program on KLRB. It's in True Magazine, December 73. Where Richard Nixon mentions to the Warren Commission in an interview 3 months after the assassination of John Kennedy. This was Exhibit 1973, page 831, Volume 23 of the Commission hearings. Mr. Nixon was advised, he advised him the only time he was in Dallas was just prior to the assassination. He vaguely remembered some invitation in April, but it never materialized. The Warren report said that he told them the only time that he was in Dallas was November 20th and 21st. And the Bantam paperback of the Warren report said that Richard Nixon was only in Dallas November 20th and 21st. But Manchester, in Death of a President, says Nixon was in Dallas Friday, November 22nd, 1963. He departed just before Kennedy's plane landed at Love Airfield. And Jim Bishop, in the book The Day Kennedy Was Shot, says that Richard Nixon took American Airlines Flight 82 on Friday morning, the 22nd, and went back to Washington the day that Kennedy was landing. Both of them were at Love Field, one just a little bit before the other, one leaving and the other arriving. There is this discrepancy between the Warren Report version and these other authors, and Penn Jones Jr., I've quoted many times on my show, described a meeting at the home of Mr. Rich Murchison, the oil man, a big supporter of, he gave money to Lyndon Johnson, and particularly Richard Nixon. There was a meeting of J. Edgar Hoover at the home of Murchison with Richard Nixon for the purpose of discussing this particular event that was going to take care of the next day. So while the congressman thinks that people all remember what happened, Richard Nixon actually didn't, or he says he didn't to the Warren Commission. There's an excellent article in Harper's Magazine written by Andrew St. George called The Cold War Comes Home. And those of you who have read my Realist articles, the two articles I wrote for the Realist on why was Martha Mitchell kidnapped, and the new one on the Senate Select Committee being a part of the cover-up, that's written by a man named Andrew St. George. Now, this is a man whose background is heavy into intelligence. He has been part of clandestine operations in the Caribbean for many, many years. He was about to write a book. He's writing one book for Harper's Magazine that will come out in 1974 on the Watergate. And I think this will be a very important book. And he was writing a book, the contract's been broken, but he was writing a book with Frank Sturgis, who was arrested at the Watergate. They evidently did a lot of espionage work together in the Caribbean. And the Cold War Comes Home is very important because the emphasis of the book I'm doing, Murderville, USA, is the fact that the warfare at home escalated with slower speed than, say, Asia or Greece or the Dominican Republic. But the war against the people of the United States, the theme of Murderville is that the first blood on the streets of the battle was in Dallas when John Kennedy and Officer Tippit and Lee Harvey Oswald were killed in the week of November 22nd, 1963. And ever since then, our domestic war has escalated at a tremendous speed so that the newspaper is filled with many, many deaths that are part of this Cold War that are passing off as all kinds of slayings that are actually done by agents to get the social unrest that was created in Chile before the takeover there finalized. And Andrew St. George goes into the signs of the warfare at home very much like the outline of the book that I'm doing. He talks about the government that started with the National Security Council in 1947. The thing that interests me so much in this book is that I have done 10 years research trying to put all of this together, and this man was part of that government. and is writing about and has the same frame of reference that I have. And he talks about the National Security Council being started in 1947. Then he goes into the Bay of Pigs. Everybody calls it the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And Kennedy was going to tear the CIA to shreds, and he was simply furious. And what St. George is saying, what I know is true, is that the CIA got stronger after the Bay of Pigs. It got so strong that it could cleverly help with the assassination of John Kennedy and conceal it all these years. It became very strong and began to turn in on our own streets. If it couldn't invade Cuba, it was going to take over the United States. In other words, if Kennedy wasn't going to be the right kind of a president, or if he wasn't going to invade Cuba, so those islands could belong to the syndicate and the organized crime and the oil people and the people with various investments, as long as he wasn't going to help them out to give their Cuba back, they would bring the war on home. So the armies were turned against the people in the United States. And this article goes into the Bay of Pigs operation as not being a fiasco, but being a very successful in that the agency could tighten its muscle. You see, a man like Howard Hunt was in charge of the planning operations of the CIA. But just reason it out, he became promoted right up to the White House. So it couldn't be a fiasco if he ends up in the White House, with 2 desks, one in room 16, one next to the president. And he wasn't such a failure. The man kept moving up in position since the Bay of Pigs, so nothing was changed, and just Howard Hunt was one example of being promoted. Well, St. George goes into the early 60s, where he says a disturbing development came within the CIA, which was the illegal entry known as a bag job, and it became one of the intelligence mega machines accepted data acquisition methods. And he goes into the methods in which the CIA used people for bag jobs and trick shops they set up all over the world that worked for what he called and they called the company. He says, at home, we have metamorphized in a short quarter of a century. Now, this is since World War II, and this is what my research tells me. From a pluralistic, open market society into one of the world's most tightly controlled, most relentlessly manipulated technological nations. The centralized, bureaucratic, technicist manipulation of energy resources, foreign affairs, communications, and presidential elections means that we are creating a post-industrial society model of what is known as a technotronic command society. Just today, the new thing about gas rationing, everybody will be controlled about how many miles they can go because their gas will be limited. There's going to be a lot of rationing of food and energy, and he says that this is for a purpose. Then St. George says, isn't it strange that what they had in mind all along, we never meant to democratize Greece or Santo Domingo. We meant to democratize ourselves. And this is what I said when Hitler lost the war in World War II, he came to this country and to the Bahamas and his men into the aerospace and warfare industries to rebuild Hitler's Gestapo over in America. So the idea that we were giving aid, AID, and Marshall Plan and all aid to foreign countries was, in fact, to put in military dictatorship so we could maintain those resources for our own profit. St. George said through the 50s and 60s we had slogans, one after the other, like brinkmanship, containment, nation building, the domino theory. There was a precipitation of unfacts and constant propaganda, making the necessary climate for image making in America and management structure. And the Watergate shows the foreign intervention was drawing to a close. Now, what he said was, from now on, America would have to generate the climate of defactualization and policeness right at home. What I said in the Realist, the second article I did, was 1972 was the most important election. Richard Nixon had to win it because men like Allende down in Chile had gone before the United Nations, and other countries were going to follow. And they were going to show how America was exploiting all of their minerals and labor and taking the goodies and the energy or everything they needed from these lands where the third world wants to exist or the people want to better their standard of living. And he took this to the United Nations, and the Congress was looking into the investigations of these multinational corporations. So 72 was an important year, whether you were going to break up ITT or whether you were going to let it keep its power over other people's lives, whether you were going to force out Howard Hughes, smoke him out through court trials and appearances, or whether he was going to continue whoever he is running the White House from wherever he's located, which is England right now. The president of Nicaragua just spent the weekend with him in England, and they have a little conference on what they're going to do with the people in Nicaragua and run them like a little game board. People work from morning to night, and these men are manipulating them at every level. Nothing goes back to the people, but the manipulation is done by men like Hughes and ITT. So what you have is a drawing to a close, St. George said, a foreign intervention. If a new person came who was elected, who accepted what Allende said and left the ITT off his back so those people could improve their standard of living, it wouldn't be good for the profit of a few corporations. So we had to step in, and that's what St. George said. And then he said the Watergate helped many unsolved mysteries. They began to clear up. We must bear in mind, he said, that the principal object of the men, implicated in the Watergate was one of transformation of presidential power from where he used to persuade us into a power where he commanded us as a chief executive and demanded us whatever he wanted, you see. We know now that behind the scenes they labored to increase the number of White House enemies, not to diminish it. Nixon, he claims, didn't want to get along with a lot of people. He wanted to create these enemies. And they stockpiled enemies and they went shopping for more. But history is telling us now that there was a question, he said, a matter of internal controls going on. And he talks about the conflict between the CIA and the FBI in the 60s and J. Edgar Hoover sensing that the government was in particular trouble and dire danger, you know. And he goes out how the director of the FBI didn't mind a little wiretapping or bugging. Now this sounds very much like the realist articles if you've read them. And this is St. George. He said Hoover loathed atheistic Reds, long-haired hippies, Black Panthers, fuzzy-minded do-gooders, Martin Luther King, but he also hated the CIA. He thought they were a group of liars and high-domed intellectuals, insolent Yaleys who sneered down on him. And he believed in setting certain limits and certain standards. And this is what I felt. He would not object to eliminating some of those classes that I mentioned before, but I don't think he would have gone into the shooting of George Wallace with as much relish as he would, say, framing Ted Kennedy. He had a limit. Believe it or not, J. Edgar Hoover had a limit. And he said for 40 years, no special agent fired a loaded gun into the temple of a suspect double agent. But he felt that these people were working with assassination. The article says assassination, dismissal under extreme prejudice, accompanied by a wink and a forefinger, imitating a slit throat. That's what the CIA was doing. It was doing it in Guatemala, Brazil, Saigon, Rio de Janeiro, and now it was common talk in Washington, D.C. There's tainted ways we're working at home in America. And I think that's important, that St. George, who was to co-author a book with Sturgis, who's been in the intelligence agencies for so long, is able to come out and say these things. Now here's something else he says in the article. He says Hoover was proven fatally right. You know, the next article, the newsletter I'm going to do for the realist has to do with why was J. Edgar Hoover murdered. And he says Hoover was proven fatally right. The CIA was handing out bribes to politicians of banana republics in the 50s and 60s. And then they got really heavy in Miami, New York, Washington, Baltimore, Atlanta, and so forth. And people were using the CIA as a cover, and they were really into heavy espionage. And he goes into the list of some of the agents. It's an excellent book because it says in 1968, Nixon and his men saw their vision was cold, mechanical, and they were technicians under the guise of national security. And he also makes a point, and it was important when men testified before the commission, Haldeman and Ehrlichman and all these men, when they refer to national security, the old goat, Sam Ervin, thinks they're talking about a threat from a foreign country coming over. They're talking about the threat of the natives in America being a danger to their power structure. He says the 60s in Washington was full of senior officials, chilly with self-doubt under the greatcoats of authority. And they were hiding under national security. Henry Kissinger led that White House mob. And he goes into how the CIA has to take over the FBI and the power struggle. As 1960 drew to a close, John Ehrlichman began in the White House to have his own secret army. He would not, the CIA and the FBI were something different, but Ehrlichman began to hire the New York City Special Service clothesman Charles Colson and their own private army. The article goes into the operatives they put out in the field and how they were going to take over the government and the traps that they got themselves into. The White House crew that was arrested on June 17, 1972, was a private intelligence group of John Mitchell, John Ehrlichman. Both the CIA and the FBI had known, of course, about the existence of the Hunt and Liddy team. The CIA had infiltrated it with an agent, and they said Martinez's codename was Rolando and that he had filtered the group. But the closing of the article of St. George is this. He has a quotation from Richard Helms saying, "A pity about the president, you know. They really blew it. The sad thing is we all think that's the end of it, and it may just be the beginning of something worse." They got caught, and that was the end of one era. What would take place is something worse. Well, what do we see in Washington, D.C. in the week of November the 12th, 1973? We see Mr. Gerald Ford, who's sure to become President of the United States, who worked with the Warren Commission, who was the man making the contact for G. Gordon Liddy to get his job in the Treasury Department, who had money washed that he didn't account for, who was funded by the aerospace and warfare technicians in Dallas, Texas, Dallas-Fort Worth area, who has voted against all the different civil rights bills, who's been a warmonger as long as he's been in the House. He's gung-ho about escalating the war in Asia and bombing them, making a parking lot out of Vietnam. That's the man they're talking about becoming president. And then the special prosecutor is Mr. Jaworski, as I said, from the CIA foundations. And Gerald Ford is a member of the espionage establishment. In order to be on the Warren Commission and write a fictitious book like he did, you have to be a member of the espionage establishment. So you have Jaworski, and then you have Mr. Saxby, suggested as Attorney General, who tells you right off the bat, I'm going to close that case. Well, the role of Patrick Gray as head of the FBI was to close investigations. Everything that was smacked of a conspiracy, he closed, whether it was the mafia, handling of money with the Teamsters in Las Vegas, or the ITT case, he was the one that put the initials to close that. The Watergate case, he destroyed evidence and tried to hush that up. And the killings of blacks and Chicanos in Los Angeles, he covered that. He was the one who called the judge to stop prosecute Ellsberg for the Pentagon case. Saxby will be in the same ilk. His role will be to stop investigations. So St. George says what we're going to get in Washington is something worse, and I believe it. I just got out 2 articles today of General Haig isolating Richard Nixon more than ever, and Haig is the one who actually runs the White House. He receives the orders down, and he commands, and he runs the White House. Now, there's another subject for those of you who followed the Watergate from the very beginning and up through a year and a half already. There's an article in Washington Post this week that the CIA produced a note which came out at a hearing dated June 28, 1972, signed by Richard Helms, in which he says that the Watergate, the FBI should not investigate the Mexican connections, that they should try and close the investigation of the Watergate arrest, anything having to do with the Mexican money. Now that's in direct conflict with testimony told before the Senate under oath that there's some pounding outside the window. Can you hear it? I had to throw something outside. I can hardly talk. They're pounding outside the window here, beating some bongo drums. Let me tell them to be quiet out there. 1 second. Can you be quiet? Can you be quiet? Okay. That covers it. They're beating these drums out there. I can't hear myself talk. Okay, back to the memo. Richard Helms signed a memo dated July 28, 1972, in which he said, it's up to the FBI to lay some cards on the table. We're unable to help. And he says, we don't want you to get into the Mexican investigation, the Mexican money, and the money washing down and the laundered money. The FBI should stay out of the laundered Mexican bank and that was traced to the Nixon re-election committee. And it was Richard Helms who said under oath that he gave the go-ahead, he assured Patrick Gray or Dean that there was nothing to stop investigating, that there was nothing involved with the CIA and the Watergate affair, that they had his word that they could go ahead and investigate. And while he's saying that under oath, and Dean is giving one bit of testimony, and Patrick Gray about the same thing, a memo has appeared now showing that the CIA was involved down in the Mexican money washing with the committee to re-elect the president, and they also contributed to the cover-up. Now, the Congress has sent a letter to Mr. Helms over in Tehran, where he's the U.S. ambassador, asking for clarification, explanation. You see what's going on in the Watergate. If you read the sentences of Donald Segretti, he got 6 months in jail, and I'm sure he'll get out in 2 on good behavior. They want a clarification. The man should just simply be fired and brought home and taken away and dropped from service like McCord and Hunt were fired from what they were doing. The CIA supplied for the Watergate affair. It supplied for the plumbers illegally against the Constitution. They broke Bill of Rights, entering property, stealing, wiretapping, bugging. They gave cameras. Then they developed the film back at the CIA. They gave disguises and wigs. They provided typewriters to forge documents of the Pentagon Papers. They supplied the name of safe houses in Washington and around the country for these operatives to meet secretly. Supplied wigs and identification cards and aliases for men involved with Dita Beard in Denver, up at Chappaquiddick, and the Ted Kennedy affair, the night they were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. They used darkroom photographers, CIA photographers down in Miami, for the same team that have been involved for many, many years working for them. The CIA is involved in every single one of these things, and they want a explanation from Mr. Helms in Tehran. Mr. Helms will send back some ridiculous answer instead of being removed from office to show that they want to clean up this affair in Washington. And he'll stay on running the CIA from Tehran, and they'll just say, well, he'll come up with some feeble excuse, and nobody will be punished for what they're doing. Donald Segretti, I mentioned him because he got a sentence that was 6 months, and there was a list of the different agents he had hired. He had spent $110,000. But the whole point of the Watergate is not how much money was spent or how many people were involved, what are their names, but what were they doing? The Senate Select Committee still doesn't want to go into that. Sam Ervin came out with an article this week. He hopes the panel will wind up its work soon. He wanted to wind it all up by Thanksgiving. That's next week. Wind it all up. They didn't have Charles Colson as a witness. They didn't have a whole stream of witnesses. They never did get Martha Mitchell. They didn't have Dwight Chapin, the appointment secretary. What about A. Jill Crow, went to the Department of Transportation. They want to wind it up by Thanksgiving, and they hardly even got it started. They're just a terrible disgrace. When Donald Segretti was on just the week of October the 29th, there was a diagram of different witnesses that he had called. You remember there's the gemstone witnesses, Mr. Gregory and Buckley and Crystal. Well, Mr. Buckley testified. Then Chapman's friends, there was Frieden and Mrs. Goldberg, and Sedan Chair, Mr. Greaves and McMinoway. Those two testified. Then Segretti had these other operatives. There was Burdick and Norton and Bentz, Kelly, he testified. O'Brien, Sheevan, Carhan, Johnson, Martin, Bryas, Svatnik, Wishy, Opovich, Wenenberg, Zimmer, Neely, Friedman, and Brill. Now those are some more of the operatives that he had. You remember the Tackwood allegations and Lemmer, the agent provocateur down in Miami, who said there's going to be violence and bombs thrown. And Tackwood particularly said they were planning on killing a lot of congressmen and having a martial law plan in the event that the Democratic Party selected a candidate that could win that ticket. And as Frank Sturgis, the rest of the Watergate, had hotel reservations for young Republicans coming in. And one of those young Republicans was Mr. Bentz, who was an SS Gestapo man, a stormtrooper with Hitler. How young could he be? And how many more of these people? I see these names like Svatnik, Opovich, Wenenberg, Zimmer. Were any of those, along with Bentz, stormtroopers also? What really was planned? How many weapons had been purchased? There were arsenals of weapons purchased. See, this long list of people that I give you, each one of those was supposed to go out and get 5. So like a chain letter. Add it all up, and you see how the committee isn't interested in finding out what they were going to do with all these people. They certainly couldn't use all these people to just bug McGovern. He was well covered, and nobody else was running. What were all these people for? Burdick, Norton, Bentz, Kelly, O'Brien, Sheevan, Carhan, Johnson, Martin, Bryce, Spotnik, Wishy, Abovich, Wenenberg, Zimmer, Neely, Friedman, and Brill. You see, we know about certain letters that were written by Mr. Greaves or certain acts that McMinoway did, but what were all these other people doing? What were they supposed to do? And the figure was 110,000 that they got, but you see, the convention never came off in terms of violence because the key men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. So when the committee winds up its work by Thanksgiving, if it does, it will be a total disgrace to what's happening. When Archibald Cox was fired and his office was cleaned out and the FBI and marshals moved in, he had a lot of things on his desk. He had requested the White House for logs from Ehrlichman's aides, David Young, E. Jill Crow, Charles Colson, G. Gordon Liddy, and Howard Hunt, the dates of June 19th, 1971 to December 71. He wanted to see those papers because, you see, the White House plumbers were not investigators. They were activists. In the fall of 71, the dates that he wants to see those papers are the dates that Louis Tackwood said the martial law plan, the Squad 19, was being formed. The Ehrlichman's office is linked to Roy Ash and the Office of Management Budget. They are manipulators of behavior that can start civil war, just like this was a conduit of money, Linton Industries and Roy Ash, of overthrowing the Greek electoral process and putting in a military dictatorship. Those papers will never be delivered to Jaworski now. He'll never go into that. Cox had all requested the logs of meetings between the president and the plumbers. He'll never get those. He asked for papers that they were kept in the White House, and then later, A. Jill Crow moved from the department to the Department of Transportation. Mrs. Howard Hunt was on a plane crash December the 8th, 1972, and on December the 9th, A. Jill Crow became the Undersecretary of Transportation and worked with the National Transportation Safety Board. Well, in this interim, from December, he went there December the 9th, and December the 19th are the papers that Archibald Cox wanted. He said if they are secret papers in the White House, that's one thing, but what they did was take papers from the Department of Transportation back to the White House that E. Jill Crow was working on, and those are locked up, and the new investigator will never go into those. The special projects he wanted were called Project Odessa and Project Number M1. Jaworski will never go into those. That is not what he's there for. All of that stuff that was taken from Archibald Cox's desk could open up a whole can of worms of what Dialog Conspiracy is about. You see, the evidence does exist, but it can be destroyed. It's been collected now from Archibald Cox's desk, and like tapes 2 or 9 or 7 or whatever, or they can be destroyed. So they've been taken away from the Department of Transportation, and it makes it more difficult to solve all these various crimes, like the Hunt plane crash or the Wallace shooting. Well, I see our time is running up. I hope you forgive me for that short interruption. I get distracted here, so I took the liberty of hushing them up, and they were pretty good after that. When I get mean, they were pretty quiet. So we'll see you next week. And okay.